You are locked in a stone cell beneath the greatest arena ever built. Above you, 50,000 Romans have just watched your husband die fighting a lion. The crowd is leaving, the torches are dimming. Then you hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming closer. A shadow fills your doorway. It's the gladiator who survived today's massacre. He's covered in blood that isn't his own. A guard unlocks your cell. The gladiator points at you. This isn't a horror movie. This was Tuesday in the Roman Empire. What I'm about to show you is the part of Roman history they don't teach in schools. The systematic, state-sponsored nightmare that unfolded after the crowds went home. This isn't speculation, it's documented by Roman writers themselves, and the evidence is literally carved into the walls beneath the Colosseum. If you stay until the end, you will never look at ancient Rome the same way again. Hollywood has been lying to you about gladiators for decades. Gladiator, Spartacus. These films show you the blood, the combat, the honor, and the rebellion. What they don't show you is what happened in the hours after the games ended, when the public spectacle transformed into something far more sinister. I'm talking about a system so disturbing that modern historians had to create a new Latin term for it, victoria carnalis, the carnal victory. The Romans themselves never used this name because to them it wasn't remarkable enough to need one. It was simply normal. Here's what we know for certain. Roman writers like Martial, Juvenal, and Seneca documented a world where conquered women were warehoused beneath arenas and distributed as prizes. Not metaphorically, literally handed out like rations to gladiators who performed well. The Roman state, the government itself, operated this system with the same bureaucratic efficiency used to build roads and aqueducts. Think about that. The same civilization that gave us concrete and a form of representative government also perfected the industrialization of sexual violence. Before we go deeper, I need you to do something. Look at the like button right now. If you believe hidden history deserves to be exposed, even when it's uncomfortable, hit that button and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because this story isn't just about Rome. It's about what empires do when no one is looking. Now, let's descend into the Hypogeum. To understand what happened in those underground chambers, you first have to understand how Rome turned human beings into inventory. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale. And it began the moment Roman legions conquered new territory. When Rome crushed a rebellion in Gaul or annihilated a city in Judea, they didn't just win a battle, they processed an entire population. It was like a factory assembly line for human suffering. The abuse didn't end after Cyrus's ban. It simply returned to the darkness of the Hypogeum, where it had always primarily operated. Now here is what should truly disturb you. This system didn't end because of a moral awakening. The games continued for centuries, even after Rome officially converted to Christianity in the 4th century AD. Gladiatorial combat persisted for decades. The last recorded fight occurred in 404 AD, when a monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena to stop a battle and was torn apart by an outraged crowd. Only then did Emperor Honorius permanently ban gladiatorial combat. But even that didn't end the system of captivity beneath the arenas. The infrastructure remained. The practice of taking war captives remained standard military procedure throughout the Byzantine period. The system eventually faded, not because of ethical progress, but because the Roman Empire itself collapsed. When the machinery of conquest stopped, the supply of captives dried up. The institution died from lack of resources, not from moral evolution. Today, when tourists visit the Colosseum, they take selfies in front of magnificent arches and marvel at ancient engineering. Tour guides talk about gladiatorial combat and animal hunts. Most never mention what happened in the chambers below. Yet the stones are still there. Those rings bolted into the walls haven't rusted away. The scratch marks from desperate fingernails remain preserved beneath centuries of dust. The ledgers that recorded human beings as inventory items are stored in Vatican archives and museums across Europe, available to anyone who wishes to read them. We're not talking about a few isolated incidents. This was policy. This was infrastructure. This was normal. The Colosseum stands as a monument to what empire truly means, not just the grand architecture and military victories we celebrate, but the industrialized horror required to maintain absolute power. Every stone in that arena was bought with more than money. It was paid for with lives deliberately destroyed, in some of the most systematic ways humans have ever devised. The spectacle on the sand was only the part Rome wanted you to see. The other half happened in the chambers beneath your feet. In the moments after, the crowd's roar faded into silence. Those voices, the ones that weren't supposed to be preserved, the ones Roman chroniclers didn't consider worth recording, are still there in those walls, if you're willing to listen. And that's the story they don't teach in history class. If this revealed something you've never heard before, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep uncovering the history they tried to erase. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next investigation into the darkest corners of the past.
Roman law provided no protection. You couldn't appeal to magistrates because, legally, you weren't a person. You couldn't even take your own life, one of the few escapes Roman culture sometimes respected, because suicide would deprive the state of its property. And even in death, your body would still be used, just differently. This was psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. The humiliation of conquered women wasn't a side effect of Roman military policy. It was a deliberate strategy. The goal was to break the spirit of resistance so completely that future generations wouldn't dare defy Rome. Ancient sources make this explicit. After crushing the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, the historian Josephus records that Romans deliberately distributed Jewish women among the legions and the games, specifically to demonstrate to the survivors that they had not only lost their sovereignty, they had lost the ability to protect their families. The message was clear: defy Rome, and this is what happens to your daughters. But occasionally, this system broke in unexpected ways. For all its industrialized cruelty, Rome still clung to certain fictions about itself. The empire saw itself as bringing civilization and order to the barbarian world. That self-image required that some horrors remain hidden. Which brings us to an event that forced the system into uncomfortable visibility: female gladiators. On extremely rare occasions, women fought in the arena. Ancient sources disagree about who these women were. Some were slaves forced to fight, but others appear to have been noblewomen who, in a society that gave women almost no agency, sought the arena as a perverse form of power and fame. Their existence scandalized Rome's elite. The satirist Juvenal wrote with dripping contempt about aristocratic women who trained with gladiator weapons, sneering, "What sense of shame can be found in a woman who wears a helmet?" In 200 AD, Emperor Severus Superius attended games in Antioch that featured female fighters. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who was present, something unexpected happened. The Greek audience reacted with shock and discomfort, treating the fights with the solemnity reserved for male gladiators. But the Roman spectators jeered, shouted sexual comments, and treated the entire event as an obscene joke. The female fighters weren't seen as warriors. They were viewed as a sexual spectacle, accidentally placed in a venue meant for deadly combat. Severus was reportedly mortified, not by the violence, but how crudely his fellow Romans reacted. The dignity of the games, his propaganda machine, was being undermined by the audience's inability to separate violence from sex when women were in the arena. So, he banned women from fighting entirely. Think about what this tells us. The problem wasn't protecting women from violence. Female captives were still being held in chambers beneath this very arena. The real issue was that the violence had become too visible, too public, in a way that made Rome's self-image uncomfortable. The emperor had no problem with the abuse. He simply wanted it to happen in the shadows where he believed it belonged. These are not the voices history typically preserves. Roman chronicles name emperors and generals, record military victories and architectural achievements. They do not write down the names of conquered women, catalogued as property. But the stones remember. The architecture itself tells us something crucial. This system was designed for efficiency and repetition. These weren't improvised assault locations. They were purpose-built facilities with specific features intended to facilitate what happened inside them. Compare this to how Rome managed other aspects of the games, and the pattern becomes clear. Gladiator barracks, animal facilities, weapons storage, every element of arena infrastructure was carefully planned and standardized across the empire. The captive chambers fit the same pattern. This was state-sponsored infrastructure for systematic abuse. Some historians argue that we shouldn't read too much into these chambers, that they could have served various purposes, and that we may be projecting modern concerns onto ambiguous evidence. But when you combine the architecture, the literary references, the patterns of Roman military culture, and basic logic about how the system operated, the picture becomes painfully clear. Now we have to confront the hardest part of this story: what this system actually meant for the women trapped inside it. History is almost completely silent on their individual experiences. We don't have diaries. We don't have testimony. What we have are ledgers that list them as numbers and property inventories that describe them like livestock. Female Germanic, approximately 20 years, good health, assigned to Colosseum holding. But we can reconstruct the nightmare from what we know about Roman conquest. These women were not random prisoners. They came from contexts of absolute trauma. When Rome conquered a region that resisted, like during the Dacian Wars or the suppression of the Britannic Revolt led by Boudica, the aftermath followed a methodical military procedure. After the final battle, the civilian population was processed. Men of fighting age were killed or enslaved for hard labor. Children were separated and sold to Eastern slave markets, never to see their families again. Women of childbearing age were designated as captivae and transported in chains to holding facilities. For a woman in this situation, the journey to the arena was already a descent through multiple circles of hell. You had watched your village burn. You had seen your children torn from your arms. You had been chained to dozens of other women and marched hundreds of miles to Rome. You had been stripped, examined like livestock, assigned a number, and locked in a cell beneath the greatest monument of the very civilization that destroyed everything you knew. The waiting was its own form of torture. You could hear everything. The roar of the crowd above as people you might have known were executed in creative ways. The screams of animals being slaughtered. The cheers when a gladiator delivered a particularly skillful killing blow. And you knew you would never leave. There was no ransom, no prisoner exchange. Rome did not negotiate with the conquered. Your people, if they even survived, would never know what happened to you. You would simply disappear into the machinery of empire.
The gladiator would be shown a row of cells. Some accounts suggest he could choose. Others imply women were simply assigned, like equipment checked out of a warehouse. Either way, a guard would unlock the designated cell, the woman would be brought out, or the gladiator would enter, and the door would be locked behind them. What happened next isn't described explicitly in surviving texts, but the architecture tells the story that the sources refuse to state outright. Here's what makes this especially sinister. This wasn't a crime. It wasn't even considered morally questionable by most Romans. It was part of the operational budget of the games. The logistics of Victoria Carnalis were handled by the same administrators who scheduled animal fights and maintained arena machinery. From the state's perspective, this system solved multiple problems elegantly. It rewarded loyal gladiators cheaply. Conquered women cost the state nothing. They were already classified as spoils of war. It reinforced the gladiator's sense of power and privilege without granting him real freedom. And it reminded both the gladiator and the conquered peoples what Roman dominance meant. One Roman writer, his name lost, his words preserved only through later citations, put it bluntly. The victor claims his prize in the same manner the empire claims its provinces, by right of conquest. Now, let's talk about the physical spaces where this happened, because the archaeology is damning. When archaeologists first excavated beneath the Colosseum in the 19th century, they focused on the engineering marvels, the elevators that lifted animals to the arena floor, the complex tunnels for personnel and equipment. But as excavations continued, they found something unexpected. Specialized chambers that served no clear logistical purpose. These rooms are small, typically 10 to 15 square meters. They're located in a separate section of the hypogeum, away from the animal cages and the gladiator ready rooms. Their distinctive features are what make modern archaeologists uncomfortable. Stone benches line the walls, but unlike benches in other chambers, these are built at a specific height. Iron rings are anchored into the walls at multiple levels, some near the floor, some at waist height, and others higher. The doors are heavy wood, reinforced with iron, and they lock only from the outside. The walls in several chambers show evidence of scratching, desperate fingernails attempting to dig through solid stone. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century AD, mentions that beneath major amphitheaters were chambers for those awaiting their use. His phrasing is deliberately vague, but in context, he is discussing the logistics of the games, specifically the management of human resources. But the most disturbing evidence comes from graffiti. In the hypogeum beneath the amphitheater in Capua, the same city where Spartacus launched his rebellion, archaeologists found scratch marks on cell walls. Some inscriptions are in Latin, others appear in languages from across the empire. Most are fragmentary, but a few remain legible. One, written in crude Latin by someone clearly not a native speaker, translates roughly to, "I was Aemilia of the Brigantes. I saw my children killed. Now I am nothing." Another, likely in a Celtic dialect, has been translated as, "To any god who listens, let me die before tomorrow." The Spartacus rebellion, which erupted in 73 BC, was burned into Roman cultural memory. 78 gladiators escaped, raised an army of 70,000, and nearly brought Rome to its knees. For 2 years, they humiliated legion after legion. When Rome finally crushed them, it crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, one body every 40 meters for 200 kilometers, a forest of crosses stretching from Rome to Capua. That trauma never left the Roman psyche. Every time a gladiator picked up a sword, every lanista who ran a gladiator school, every spectator in the stands, they all remembered that these men had once come terrifyingly close to burning Rome to the ground. So how do you control incredibly dangerous, incredibly valuable men who have legitimate grievances and the combat skills to act on them? You use a combination of brutal punishment and calculated rewards, extra food rations, prize money, the promise of freedom after enough victories. But the sources hint at something else, something more primal: access to conquered women. The documentation here is frustratingly scattered. Roman writers mention it in passing, as if it's too obvious to explain. But when you piece together references from Martial, Juvenal, and later sources, a pattern emerges. After a particularly impressive victory, especially during major games funded by emperors or wealthy senators, gladiators who fought well were granted what ancient sources vaguely call privileges of the victor. Modern historians, cross-referencing military reward systems and slave management practices, believe this often meant access to female captives held beneath the arena. The process appears to have been chillingly bureaucratic. The gladiator would be brought down into the hypogeum, the vast underground network beneath the arena floor. Still wearing his armor, still covered in blood and sand, he would be escorted by a ludus official or arena administrator. They would move through tunnels lit by oil lamps, passing animal cages and mechanical lifts until they reached a specific section of holding cells. These were not ordinary prison cells. Archaeological evidence from amphitheaters across the empire, Capua, Pompeii, and even beneath the Colosseum reveals small chambers with distinctive features. Stone benches, iron rings anchored into the walls at waist height and near the floor, and doors that lock only from the outside. Some rooms show evidence of chains permanently mounted into the stone. These women held in these cells were known as captivae damnatae, condemned war captives. They had already been processed through Rome's bureaucratic machinery of conquest. Their names were recorded in ledgers by officials called commentari, who tracked state-owned property. Each woman was assigned a number and a category based on her origin: Germanica, Britannica, Parthica. Men of military age were sent to die in mines or arenas.
Children were sold into slave markets across the empire. Women were designated as captiva, war prizes belonging to the state. Here's where it becomes truly chilling. Under Roman law, these people were no longer legally human. They were classified as res, things, property, the same category as furniture or livestock. A conquered woman had no more rights than a chair. You could do anything to her, and it wasn't technically a crime, because you cannot commit a crime against an object. But Rome didn't just dehumanize people through law, they did it through spectacle. The games weren't simply entertainment, they were political theater designed to psychologically dominate both the conquered and Rome's own citizens. When you watched a captured Germanic chieftain fight a lion, you weren't just watching a man die. You were watching Rome demonstrate what happens to anyone who defies the empire. And during the midday lull, when the elite left for lunch, that's when the cruelty escalated. Historians call these fatal charades, mythological reenactments where condemned prisoners were forced to act out famous myths, except the deaths were real. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century AD, describes these scenes with disturbing casualness, as if he's reviewing a restaurant. He writes about a prisoner dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could charm any creature with his song. They led him into the arena with a lyre and released a bear. Martial notes, almost disappointed, that the music didn't work this time, as the bear mauled the man to death while 50,000 people ate honeyed dates. In another passage, and I'm warning you, this is deeply disturbing, Martial describes a woman forced to reenact the myth of Pasiphae, who famously mated with a sacred bull. For this prisoner, the reenactment meant being publicly assaulted by an animal in front of thousands of spectators until she died from her injuries. Read that again. The Roman state designed a system where human beings were raped to death by animals as lunchtime entertainment. This wasn't the sick fantasy of one mad emperor. This was decades of standard operating procedure. Senators brought their children to watch. The events were advertised on city walls. Vendors sold snacks. Martial even boasts, whatever myth tells us, the arena makes real. And here's the most horrifying part. He meant it as praise. He was impressed by the efficiency. This was the environment, the industrialized, bureaucratic machinery of cruelty that also processed conquered women into the reward system for gladiators. Now, let's talk about the men who received these rewards. Gladiators existed in a bizarre contradiction that Rome never fully resolved. They were simultaneously the lowest and highest members of society. Slaves with less legal status than a dog, yet celebrities whose faces appeared on mosaics and whose names were graffitied on walls by adoring fans. Ancient graffiti from Pompeii calls one gladiator the sigh of the girls, and another the glory of the ladies. There are documented cases of noble women sneaking into gladiator barracks, paying off guards for private encounters. The gladiator Sergius reportedly had affairs with multiple married patrician women, causing enormous scandals. Even stranger, their bodily fluids were commodified. Gladiator sweat was collected after fights, mixed with olive oil, and sold as an aphrodisiac and beauty treatment. Think about that level of celebrity worship. These were enslaved men whose perspiration was being bottled and marketed to the upper classes. But Rome lived in constant terror of them.